Nick, the demographic explosion that we've seen in Africa and we're likely to see over the next century or so has meant that cities have taken on a new form, new cities have grown bigger and so on. But the underlying question is, how competitive are these new cities that are springing up?
In Africa, we are seeing new nodes of economic development that have huge implications for the continent. A city is a fairly recent phenomenon, actually. Most people don't realize only in the last few hundred years have large cities come about. And only in the last 20 or 30 years, what we call megacities. A megacity is 20 million people or more in an urban area. And as you rightly say, our demographics forecast that the number of people who move to cities in Africa is going to explode in the next, forget the century, next 20 years. Cities are particular because they have large populations that can trade, become creative, and operate very efficiently. But for a modern city to succeed in a knowledge economy, this requires a different set of infrastructures and skills in managing and making a city work. Whether African cities in the next 20 years can handle both the massive increase in population and ensure that business and creative people have access to the cutting-edge technologies, to the future technologies, is an open question.
I always like to look at a city like Detroit, which is known for its auto manufacturing, and when that went into a slump, it's taken on to a different form of tech and music and so on. That becomes a competitive advantage. How do these competitive advantage trends emerge?
Well, what happens is you get an area like Silicon Valley, which 30 years ago, Stanford was surrounded by farmland, becomes a hub for creative people around a particular resource or technology. So Johannesburg grew out of the gold mining. In fact, the South African economy owes its sophistication, its scale and its scope to mining, because on the back of mining, finance, industrial engineering, and eventually services became the center of our economy. So Detroit, as you correctly say, was born out of Henry Ford's genius in mass production, which became a motor city, and for decades then became the center of the auto industry in the world, and then went into rapid decline, to the point of significant decline. About a third of the value of that city was wiped out in the last 20 years, and the city was emptied. They were doing farming in the inner city. So it's now trying to recover. A good example of recovery would be Pittsburgh, which was a steel city that leveraged itself without going into decline into a creative city.
We've got our local government elections coming through next year, and political parties already cherry-picking which cities they're going to target. What drives that type of cherry-picking?
Well, there are two things I think are important to look at. One is natural factors, and the other is created factors. So natural factors would be like Cape Town and services and tourism, because that's its natural strength. Johannesburg has been mining and finance and business. That's its natural strength.
As we see some cities become more competitive, there are some cities which are being left behind.
Right.
What is to be done with some of those towns and cities?
Well, I'm afraid in the harsh world of Darwinian survival, the logic of some cities that is natural fades away. You can create a new logic, but that takes immense effort and investment. So if you look, for example, at Bloemfontein as a city, it's a capital of a province, but what's its economic logic? And that's a challenge for Bloemfontein. If you take Nelspruit, which has changed dramatically in the last 30 years, it's become a center of trade with Mozambique, it's got the tourist nexus, and it's now got much more focus as a provincial center. So this tide moves over time. London, for example, was a great imperial city in the colonial sense. It's now become a global financial hub. It's almost imperial in that sense. It's a virtual force around the world for money, for intellect, for finance. I've just spent a month in the city and was astonished by how it's gone from one level of performance totally to another by reinventing itself. So cities have to reinvent themselves.
Much of the criticism, especially in African cities where cities have been growing at a very phenomenal rate, has been the lack of planning. But with all the technology and the big data that we've got, why are we not planning our cities in a better way?
City planning is very, very complex because you're touching on all aspects: physical, infrastructural, pathways to markets, the movement of people. One of the weird things about this country is that when the World Bank were here in the early days, post-94, I asked them, what was the biggest, most striking thing of coming to Johannesburg? They said, the poor commute the furthest. Because of apartheid, we put poor people on the edge. In most cities, poor live in the inner city and have lower transport costs. Here it's the opposite. So plan all of that is not easy to do. And unfortunately, in many of our cities in Africa, like Dar es Salaam, like Lagos is 20 million people. They don't have the finance to really make those investments. So it tends to become a patchwork and tends to become a logistical challenge, which Lagos is. And Johannesburg has deteriorated significantly in spite of our investment. It's the gridlock. You have to get things to be efficient, whether it's broadband, the roads, or electricity. These are the fundamental factors that allow business people and government to work efficiently. In winning cities, those services add to your advantage, don't detract from it.
Clem Sunter likes to use the analogy for countries of a soccer league table, where you've got some countries that are at the top and some are being relegated at the bottom. In terms of African cities, where would you say the top cities are and the ones that are close to it?
Well, the top city still, in spite of the re-rating of the Nigerian GDP, is unquestionably Johannesburg, and in particular Sandton. There's nothing to compare in the continent for the moment with Sandton City. If you look at the investment in about 6 to 8 square kilometers, Sandton is a hub. Professional services, financial services, company headquarters, stock markets, and logistics. It is just simply a hub. It may be overtaken in the next 20 years, although I doubt it. The province needs to leverage that to realize it must make investments at the top end, not only at the bottom end of infrastructure, but at the top end, personal safety, quality of electricity supply, broadband connectivity, hubs. Cities are about intense, dense communications, areas where people can work together in smaller units or in a big area.